A tired nurse falls asleep in a military ambulance and wakes up the next day in the middle of a war zone at the border. Lost, with no allies and surrounded by danger, she is saved by an enemy veteran. To survive, they must work together, and she soon learns that the real battle is not about the uniforms, but about our shared humanity. The nurse had gone weeks without proper sleep. Her tired eyes were like a mirror of the battlefield, dark, worn out, and marked by endless nights without rest. In the improvised military hospital where she worked, stretchers filled faster than they could be emptied. Every day was the same. Screams of pain, the smell of disinfectant mixed with blood, and the constant pressure of saving one life while another was dying on the table beside her. She wasn't in the war to carry a weapon. Her uniform wasn't that of a soldier, but of a woman with steady hands that tried to heal. Still, that didn't keep her away from the battlefield. Every patient carried the violence, the gunpowder, the wounds that seemed impossible to close. The nurse felt she was fighting a different war, keeping hope alive in the middle of chaos. Her calling had brought her here. Since childhood, she had dreamed of helping others, of becoming a nurse to ease pain. What she never imagined was that this dream would lead to a field hospital, where reality was harsher than any lesson in nursing school. There were no manuals here, only fast decisions about who lived and who didn't. And each choice drained her a little more. The long shifts felt endless. She went in before sunrise and, if lucky, came out under the stars. Between shifts, she barely ate enough to stay standing. Sometimes her hands shook, not from lack of skill but from exhaustion. On some nights, she sat in a corner of the hospital, covered her face with her hands, and breathed deeply, reminding herself in silence that she had to be strong, because her duty was greater than her fatigue. But the war gave no rest. One day there were dozens of wounded, the next day hundreds. The sound of ambulances rushing in had become part of her life. She knew them well. First the echo of wheels stirring dust, then the muted sirens so the enemy wouldn't notice, and finally the shouts of paramedics calling for help. The nurse would run each time, even when her feet could hardly carry her. In that hell, there were still small moments that reminded her why she was there. When a soldier squeezed her hand in thanks, when a young man survived against all odds, or when someone managed to smile through the pain. Those moments were like light in the darkness, enough to keep her going. But each day, that light felt harder to find. The war, in its harshness, had left marks on her character. The nurse had learned to harden her heart without losing compassion. She could speak firmly while wiping away tears. She had discovered that between life and death there was no room for doubt, and that confidence inspired trust in those around her. But when she was alone, the hardness broke, and what remained was a tired woman longing for a bit of silence, a bit of peace. The field hospital never slept. Between the sound of torn bandages, scalpels clinking on metal trays, and voices asking for blood, oxygen, or more hands, the nurse sometimes drifted into her own thoughts. How long would the war last? How much could she endure before breaking completely? She had no answers. She only knew she had to go on. That night, as she put away medical supplies after another endless day, she felt her body begging for rest. She leaned against the wall, closed her eyes for a few seconds, and promised herself she would hold on for one more day. She didn't know that her exhaustion would slowly lead her to a fate that would change her life forever. The day began with the same routine as always. The nurse received the list of wounded who had to be moved from the field hospital to a safer base, several kilometers away. These trips were repetitive, filled with pain, but also carried a small sense of relief. They meant the patients had survived long enough to be transported. The military ambulance was her space of transition, a metal capsule moving through dusty roads and ruined fields. The nurse knew that route by heart, the constant rattling of the vehicle, the bumps that shook the stretchers, and the smell of fuel mixed with disinfectant soaked into the bandages. Each trip was different because of the faces of the wounded, but the routine was almost always the same. Checking that the bandages stayed tight, monitoring breathing, moistening dry lips, and holding trembling hands against the background noise of the engine. Sometimes, during the ride, the nurse spoke softly to the wounded. They weren't real conversations, just words of encouragement that maybe they didn't hear, but that she felt were necessary. "Hold on. We're almost there. Breathe. I'm here with you." Short, simple phrases that reminded her she wasn't alone in her work. The ambulance, though shaky and closed, had become a strange kind of refuge. A place where she could do her duty without being surrounded by the open chaos of the hospital. The road, however, never let her forget that the war was close. From the windows she could see little more than destroyed fields, collapsed houses, and sometimes smoke columns in the distance. The front seemed closer each day, as if the line of fire was slowly moving toward them. Even though the ambulance carried the Red Cross painted on its sides, everyone knew it was not always respected. That constant feeling of danger mixed with a fragile sense of safety. Inside the vehicle, though unstable and dusty, she felt protected, focused on her work. The driver, a young soldier in a stained uniform, tried to keep light conversation to chase away the silence. The nurse listened but rarely answered. She was too focused on checking vital signs, adjusting bandages, and making mental calculations of how much longer until they reached the base. The wheels rattling on stones were almost hypnotic. Every jolt shook her, but at the same time rocked her like a lullaby. The transfers repeated day after day, and her body began to wear down. For the nurse, each trip was a mix of routine and endurance. Her hands moved almost automatically, as if they had memorized the motions of holding a needle, changing a bandage, or measuring a soldier's breathing. But the accumulated fatigue made everything feel slower, as if time itself stretched inside the ambulance. Looking at the wounded, she always saw the same expressions: pale faces, closed eyes, forced breaths. The war had branded them with fire, and she could only offer temporary relief on a journey filled with uncertainty. She knew some wouldn't survive the trip, and in those cases her duty was to be there, even for the last breath. Though she never said it out loud, that was what drained her most. Witnessing so many farewells with no family around. The road dust slipped through every crack of the vehicle, covering her eyelashes, her clothes, even her dry lips. She felt it as a constant reminder that they were crossing land scarred by war. Yet, inside the ambulance there was still an illusion of routine. It was a space where she felt useful, where her hands could make a difference. It was, in some way, the only sense of control she had left in a broken world. That afternoon, while watching a young soldier with his leg bandaged, she caught herself imagining what life might be like far from there. She thought of a quiet home, of a kitchen lit by sunlight, of reading a book without interruption. Dreaming was her escape, even if only for seconds, while the vehicle kept bouncing along the road. The ambulance moved forward, and with it the nurse's routine carried on. It was endless work, repetitive but full of humanity. In those transfers, between dust and silence, she felt safe, though she knew safety was only a fragile illusion. What she didn't know was that this routine, which seemed eternal, was about to break in the most unexpected way. The day felt like just another in the long list of endless shifts. The nurse, her uniform stained with iodine and dust, sat on one of the side benches of the ambulance. She had checked the wounded one last time. A young man with his shoulder bandaged, an older soldier with his leg immobilized, and another who muttered weak words in a feverish sleep. They were all stable, at least stable enough to survive the journey. The rattling of the vehicle blended with the quick beat of her own heart. She had learned to live with that constant state of alert, but this afternoon her body no longer obeyed. Her eyelids felt as heavy as lead. She had spent countless nights without sleep, running between stretchers, holding bloody bodies, making choices that drained not only her hands but also her soul. Now, on this dusty road, her exhaustion demanded its price. She leaned against the metal wall of the ambulance. The cold steel pressed into her back, but even that felt like relief. She closed her eyes for a moment, just to rest them. Only a second, she thought. She knew she shouldn't sleep, that she had to stay alert, but the war had never been generous with rest. 1 second stretched into a minute. The hum of the engine turned into a lullaby. Inside the ambulance, the sounds softened. The banging of the wheels on stones, the uneven breaths of the wounded, the quiet voice of the driver in the cabin, all faded into distant echoes. The nurse, without noticing, sank into a deep sleep, a sleep she hadn't planned, but one her body demanded. Her head tilted to the side, a lock of hair slipping out of her cap and falling across her face. She breathed calmly, for the first time in days. In that fragile shelter of unconsciousness, the war no longer existed. There were no screams, no shots, no metallic smell of blood. Only silence, darkness, and the promise of a few minutes of rest. The driver didn't wake her. Maybe he understood she needed the break. Maybe he thought that even with her eyes closed, she was still the same woman who had worked herself to exhaustion to keep strangers alive. No one in that ambulance could imagine that this harmless sleep would mark a before and after. Her dreams had no clear images. They were fragments, faces of patients she had lost, voices calling from far away, memories of a quieter life, long gone. Among those fragments was a feeling of being pulled somewhere else. Her hands tried to grab onto something, but there was nothing solid. It was like falling slowly into an empty space she didn't want to leave. The vehicle kept moving. Dust rose with every kilometer, coating the body of the ambulance in a thick layer. No one could foresee what was about to happen. The nurse, unaware, slept deeply. Her breathing was steady, her body still, as if she had finally found the peace she had been craving. But time didn't stop for her. The world outside kept turning, armies kept moving, borders were redrawn in fire. And she, asleep on that metal seat, was traveling toward a fate she could never have imagined, not even in her dreams. The last thing she felt before slipping away completely was a harder jolt than usual, a bump in the road that made the ambulance bounce. She barely opened her eyes for a second, just long enough to notice the shadow of a lone tree by the roadside. But she didn't fight to stay awake. She gave in. She closed her eyes, and the world went dark. That deep, necessary sleep would be the bridge carrying her to a new place, to a dawn that would change everything she knew. Because when the nurse opened her eyes again, she would not find the safety of the hospital, nor the rattling of the ambulance. Instead, she would wake in the middle of nowhere, in a land scarred by war alone, with no explanation of how she had ended up there. Dawn found her with heavy eyes, as if a thick veil still covered her sight. The nurse took time to understand where she was. First, she heard the silence, an unnatural, unsettling silence that contrasted with the constant sound she was used to. The ambulance engine, the labored breathing of the wounded, the rattling of wheels. Now there was nothing, only stillness. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. The air was thick, filled with smoke and the smell of burned earth. She coughed, startled. She looked around, expecting to see the metal benches of the vehicle, the stretchers, the bandages. But there was no ambulance. She was alone, sitting on dusty ground, as if someone had left her there while she slept. Her heart began to pound hard. She stood up quickly, unsteady. The wounded were gone, the driver gone, the vehicle gone. All around her was a strange landscape, an open field with the remains of burned trees and deep tracks from heavy vehicles. The horizon was pale gray, smoke rising in scattered columns that hid the rising sun. The nurse took a few uncertain steps, trying to get her bearings. She turned in circles, looking for some trace of the ambulance. There were no fresh tracks, no sound of an engine fading away, no voices. Nothing. It was as if everything she knew had vanished while she slept. The silence froze her blood. It wasn't the silence of peace, but of waiting, as if the world itself was holding its breath before disaster. In the distance, she thought she heard a metallic creak, but it faded quickly. When she strained to listen, all she heard was her own quick breathing and the pounding of her heart. Confusion mixed with growing fear. She wondered if it had all been a dream, if she was still inside the ambulance and her mind was tricking her. She pinched her arm hard. The pain was real. She was awake. She was alone. She tried to recall the last thing she saw before giving in to exhaustion. The jolt of the ambulance, the lonely tree by the road. That was all. And now she was here, in a different place, as if someone had changed the scene behind her back. She walked a few more steps, her boots sinking into the dry soil. Dust rose with each move, the wind carrying ashes that clung to her clothes. The smell of burning grew stronger. In the distance, she thought she saw the remains of a destroyed vehicle. But as she approached, it turned out to be only twisted sheets of metal, long abandoned. Nothing that explained where the ambulance or her companions had gone. The morning light spread, revealing a devastated landscape. No birds, no human voices, not even the buzz of insects. Everything was in a strange, heavy silence. That's when she felt it, the uneasy sensation of being watched. She froze, turned her head in every direction, but saw no one, only smoke and ruins. Fear tangled with confusion. She reached into the pocket of her uniform, looking for some tool, some object she could use, but found nothing, just her hands. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She told herself she was a nurse, not a soldier. Her duty was to heal, not to fight. But she also knew that here, in this place, her medical skills wouldn't matter if she couldn't survive. She sat on a rock, trying to organize her thoughts. Had she been abandoned? Did a sudden attack force everyone to flee, leaving her behind? Or had something worse happened while she slept? The questions piled up in her mind, but none had answers. She only knew she was in unknown territory, in the middle of a war that seemed to be closing in from all sides. The wind shifted, carrying distant echoes. Scattered gunfire, muffled screams, the rumble of explosions somewhere along the border. The nurse shivered. The war wasn't far. The war was all around her. And she, alone in that strange dawn, could barely understand how she had ended up there. If this story is keeping you hooked, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. That helps me keep creating more intense stories like this one. Now, let's continue. The nurse stayed still for a moment, breathing with difficulty, as if her own chest refused to accept the reality around her. At first, she thought she was still close to the field hospital, that any minute a friendly patrol would arrive to take her back. But when she looked up, she realized this was no familiar place. The ground was scarred with abandoned trenches, bomb craters, and rusty remains of war machines. It was no man's land. The wind blew hard, dragging ashes into swirling patterns in the air. The nurse looked around, searching for signs of life, but found only emptiness. The hospital was far away, too far. And the worst part was the certainty now forming in her mind. She wasn't on some in-between stretch of the route. She had woken up right in the middle of the border, where maps break apart and war belongs to no one. Every distant sound made her shiver. First came sharp gunshots, echoing like thunder far away. Then a metallic roar, maybe the engine of a tank or the heavy clank of machinery moving. The nurse hunched her shoulders, lowering her head as if that could make her invisible. Each step on the dry earth raised dust that felt like it was shouting her presence to the horizon. Her breathing quickened. The thought of walking anywhere terrified her. What if she moved toward the enemy? What if they mistook her for a spy? What if they shot her without asking? The ground beneath her feet felt like a minefield, where any step could be the last. She crouched beside a mound of dirt, trying to cover herself. From there, she studied the terrain. On one side stretched a line of rusty barbed wire, disappearing into the distance. On the other, low hills marked with fresh craters. It was clear. She was right on the edge, trapped in that cursed strip where neither side could guarantee safety. Fear mixed with a sharp uncertainty. She had never been this far from the hospital, nor this close to the front. As a nurse, she had heard stories of what happened at the border. Bodies left forgotten between trenches, soldiers trapped with no way forward or back, civilians who never returned. Now those stories surrounded her, and she was the unwilling main character in her own nightmare. A sudden sound made her turn sharply. A crack, like someone stepping on dry branches. She held her breath. Her eyes scanned the thick smoke, but saw nothing. She stayed crouched, hands pressed into the dirt, her heart pounding so loud she feared others could hear it. For endless seconds, nothing else happened, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The nurse thought of shouting, of calling for help, but stopped herself. Her instincts told her silence was the only thing that might save her. In this place, raising her voice could mean drawing fire from either side. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering her oath to protect life, and felt the irony of now having to fight for her own. She wondered what had happened to the ambulance. Had it been attacked? Had her companions fled and left her behind? Or, in some strange way, had she been carried here without realizing it? There were no answers, only growing despair. The loneliness weighed so heavily that, for a moment, she wished to hear a friendly voice. Even knowing that was impossible. Morning turned to day, and with the light came the cruel truth. She was trapped in the most dangerous place of all. A territory with no refuge, where both sides shoot first and ask later, where the rules of humanity seem erased. The nurse was on the border, and the worst part was, she had no idea how she had ended up there. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop her body from shaking. In her mind she saw the hospital, the stretchers, the patients who needed her hands. She tried to convince herself she had to go back, that she would find a way. But deep in her heart, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. War does not let go of those who fall into its grip. The sun had already risen, casting more light over the desolate landscape. The nurse stayed hidden behind a mound of dirt, her breathing fast, when a new sound made her shiver. It wasn't a distant gunshot or the roar of a tank. It was closer, sharper. The crack of branches and the metallic click of a safety being released. Her first instinct was to crouch lower, trying to blend into the ground. But instinct couldn't hide the truth. Someone was there, far too close. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break free from her chest. She closed her eyes for a moment, thinking this was the end. The war had finally caught up to her, and it had done so while she was alone and defenseless. Then, a shadow fell over her. The nurse slowly lifted her gaze and saw the figure of an armed man. His uniform, worn and caked with mud, was not from her side. The colors, the cut of his jacket, the helmet, everything confirmed he was the enemy. A veteran, by the lines on his weathered face and the scars across his skin. His gray eyes, as hard as stone, locked onto hers. The nurse said nothing. She knew any words might sound like useless begging. Her hands trembled, but she didn't raise them. She only stared, waiting for the inevitable. The veteran lifted his weapon, and for one endless second she was sure it would end there, in the dust of that broken field. But the shot never came. Instead, another sound split the air. A burst of bullets whistling past just meters away. The veteran threw himself over her, pushing her to the ground and covering her with his body. Dust exploded around them as bullets hit nearby. The attack wasn't aimed at them in particular. It was crossfire between two enemy positions. But if he hadn't moved her, she would have been exposed. The nurse opened her eyes in shock. The man who should have killed her had just saved her life. The veteran, breathing hard, looked at her seriously. "If you want to live, don't move," he whispered, his voice deep and rough with experience. She didn't answer. Her mind struggled to make sense of what was happening. Why was he protecting her? Why risk himself for someone who, by the logic of war, was his enemy? The veteran seemed uninterested in giving explanations. His sharp eyes scanned the field like someone who had survived too many battles. When the crossfire finally paused, the veteran stood and held out his hand. The nurse hesitated. Could she trust him? He was the enemy. And yet, without him she would already be dead. Her heart still racing, she took his hand and stood. "You're not safe here," he said, nodding toward the horizon. "No one is." His words were flat, without emotion, but they carried a weight that chilled her. This man knew the border well, enough to understand that no one had shelter there. They moved a few meters in silence, crouching between ruined trenches. The nurse didn't know where he was taking her, or what his true intentions were. But with each step, it became clear she had no other choice. She could try to escape alone, yes, but she was lost in hostile, unfamiliar ground. Beside him, at least, there was someone who knew how to move through this wasteland, as if every crack and shadow was already etched in his memory. As they advanced, the nurse couldn't stop looking at him. His face was hard, but beneath it was a deep exhaustion, the same one she had felt in the hospital. It was the face of someone who had seen too much. The silence between them grew heavier, until at last she spoke, her voice trembling. "Why did you help me?" The veteran didn't look at her. He kept walking, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His answer was simple. "Because the war has already taken enough from us." The words echoed in her mind. It wasn't the response she expected, but it was the one she needed. There was no compassion, no sentiment, just a simple truth spoken by a man who had learned to survive. She realized that, strange as it was, this man was now her only chance to live. And though she still felt distrust, a spark of hope began to grow inside her. Perhaps, even in this cursed borderland, there was still room for humanity. The land was a maze of ruins and dry soil. The nurse walked behind the veteran, still unsure of every step. He moved with the confidence of someone who had crossed these paths 1,000 times. Now and then he stopped, scanned the horizon, then gave a small signal to keep going. She followed in silence, knowing she wouldn't have survived an hour on her own. Hunger soon caught up with her. Since waking in the borderlands, she hadn't eaten a thing. Her stomach growled, but she didn't dare complain. The veteran, as if noticing, pulled a piece of hard bread from his pocket and handed it to her without looking. The nurse took it with trembling hands and ate slowly, grateful but unable to say thank you. It felt strange to accept help from someone who, only hours before, would have been her enemy. Fear, on the other hand, needed no food to grow. Every distant echo, every shot in the background, made her heart race. The veteran seemed immune to the sounds of war, but she watched him closely, his clenched jaw, his eyes always moving, his body tense. He felt the danger too. He just hid it better. They reached a dry stream where the veteran stopped. Sitting on a rock, he removed his right boot. The nurse was startled to see blood. A poorly treated wound on his ankle, hidden under makeshift bandages. Her first instinct was to approach. He looked at her with distrust, as if afraid to show weakness. But she spoke firmly. "Let me help you." The veteran hesitated, then nodded. The nurse knelt, unwrapped the dirty bandage, and examined the wound. It wasn't severe, But it was infected. She used what little she had. A strip of clean fabric from her uniform, water from the stream, and the skill of hands trained by pain. She worked calmly, aware that he was watching her the entire time. When she finished, she bound the wound tightly. "It's not perfect," she said, "but it'll hold." For the first time, the veteran gave a faint smile. Small, almost hidden, but enough to break the tension between them. The journey went on. They crossed low hills, hiding in abandoned trenches to avoid being seen. The sun beat down on their backs, draining their strength. The nurse, though tired, kept going. She had learned to read the veteran's pace. When he sped up, danger was near. When he stopped, something was wrong. She followed, trusting the experience that kept her alive. That night, they found shelter in a ruined hut. They shared more silence than words, but it was a different silence than at dawn. No longer pure distrust, but a silent truce. The nurse watched the veteran's hands as he cleaned his weapon, while he observed her making a makeshift bandage from scraps of cloth. Two opposite worlds, bound by the same need, survival. In the darkness, she dared to ask, "How do you keep going after all this?" The veteran didn't answer right away. He finished cleaning the rifle barrel and set it aside. Then, in a low, tired voice, he replied, "Because stopping would mean admitting that everything I did was for nothing." The nurse said nothing. His words weighed heavier than any gunshot. She understood that this man wasn't just an enemy. He was someone as weary as she was, someone carrying invisible scars of his own. The next morning, as they set out again, something had shifted. They no longer walked as strangers, but as unwilling companions. Trust wasn't whole, but it was starting to grow. And in that cursed land, where death waited at every corner, that small spark of trust was the only thing keeping them alive. The next dawn brought with it a biting cold. The nurse and the veteran had spent the night in silence inside a half-collapsed hut, its walls marked with graffiti and bullet holes. They had barely slept. The tension of the place made real rest impossible. Still, something had changed. They were no longer complete strangers. Between them lay an invisible truce, built on the simple fact that each had looked after the other. As they gathered what little they had, the nurse noticed how the veteran stared at the horizon with narrowed eyes, as if carrying a weight she couldn't see. She had learned to read faces, to find hidden pain, and she knew instantly that this man carried wounds far deeper than the bandaged ankle he limped on. Later, when they stopped beneath the shade of a dead tree, the nurse dared to ask, "What did you lose in this war?" The veteran's expression hardened, as though the question had cut him. He didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes, drew a heavy breath, and finally, in a rough voice, replied, "Everything." He stayed quiet for a few seconds more, but then went on. He told her he had been a soldier since youth, serving his country with the conviction that he was fighting for something just. But over the years he had watched the reasons fade, seen how war fed on blood, no matter the side. He confessed he had lost his comrades, his family, even his own son, who had died as a soldier on the very same front. The nurse listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on him. Each word fell heavy, and in his voice there was a pain that could not be hidden. She understood then that this man, who seemed so hard, was broken inside. When he finished, the veteran lowered his head. "I don't even know why I'm still here," he admitted. "Maybe because I have nowhere else to go." The nurse felt her throat tighten. She had treated countless wounded, but never heard a confession so raw. And in his words, she found an echo of her own pain. She too had lost colleagues in the emergency tent, patients who died in her hands, dreams of peace that never came. The war had stolen hours of her life, fragments of hope, her very youth. "You're not the only one," she said softly. "I've lost much too. Not with weapons, but with lives I couldn't save. And each time, it feels like it takes a piece of me. The veteran looked at her in surprise. For the first time, a different spark appeared in his eyes. Recognition. As if he finally saw not an enemy, but someone who understood what it meant to carry an unbearable weight. In that moment, an invisible bridge formed between them. The nurse realized that war's scars weren't in uniforms or sides, but in the hearts of those who had survived it too long. They kept walking, and their silence was no longer heavy. It was shared, filled with understanding. Watching him limp despite his bandage, the nurse thought he was living proof of what war did to people. It hardened them on the outside, but left them fractured within. By nightfall, they found shelter in an abandoned trench. As the veteran lit a small hidden fire for warmth, the nurse noticed a deep scar on his arm, the mark of an old wound. When he caught her glance, he said with bitter irony, "That one wasn't from the enemy. It was from my own." The words struck her. War didn't just divide nations. It destroyed trust between brothers in uniform. He explained. A wrong order, a failed attack, and his own unit had left him behind. Since then, he had survived alone, carrying betrayal and resentment like extra wounds. The nurse lowered her gaze. She understood then that both of them, though from different sides, were pieces on the same cruel board, used and discarded by the machine of war. That night, as distant explosions lit up the sky, the nurse thought that perhaps she hadn't found an enemy, but a companion in suffering. And in that thought, brief but certain, came the knowledge that they could trust each other more than they had ever imagined. Night had fallen, covering the border in darkness. The nurse and the veteran rested in silence inside an abandoned trench, the fire put out so they wouldn't be seen. Both knew this shelter was temporary. War never slept, and sooner or later, it would find them again. The air was thick with tension. The nurse tried to stay calm, but every distant explosion made her flinch. The veteran, however, sat still, his rifle resting on his knees, as if waiting for the inevitable. And the inevitable came. First came the sound of hurried footsteps. Then, the murmur of voices. Soldiers. They approached quickly, sweeping the area with flashlights and firing bursts into the darkness to clear any threat. There was no doubt. Someone had spotted them. The veteran stood slowly and looked at the nurse. In his eyes was a mix of resolve and resignation. "They found us," he murmured. The nurse felt her throat tighten. She searched for a way out, but there was none. They were trapped in no man's land, surrounded by soldiers who would not forgive an enemy, let alone someone standing beside one. "Run when I tell you," the veteran ordered, loading his rifle. "And you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'll stay. If I don't hold them, you won't stand a chance." Tears filled her eyes. She shook her head. "I can't leave you. Not after all this." Their silence lasted only a second, but it was enough. In that instant, they both understood. They weren't enemy and enemy. They weren't prisoner and guard. They were two survivors, bound by the same fate. The soldiers reached the edge of the trench. The nurse held her breath. The veteran raised his weapon, ready to fight. But then something shifted inside her. She remembered every wound she had treated, every life lost to war. She realized that the only way to win this battle wasn't to shoot. It was to choose differently. She stood suddenly, raising her hands high. "Stop!" she shouted with all her strength. The veteran froze, stunned. The soldiers aimed their rifles at her. The nurse stepped forward with her arms still raised. "Don't shoot. I'm a nurse. I'm not a soldier." The veteran hesitated. He could have pulled her down, stopped her. Instead, he slowly lowered his rifle. He chose to trust her, to believe in something stronger than weapons. The soldiers faltered. Some barked orders in their language. Others wanted to fire. But the sight of a nurse unarmed, hands raised in surrender, unsettled them. War had not taught them what to do with someone who posed no threat. The veteran stepped beside her, raising his hands as well. He said nothing, but his gesture said it all. He was willing to surrender with her, to risk his life not for orders, but for the choice to embrace humanity over hate. The seconds dragged like hours. The tension was sharp enough to cut. And then, something unexpected happened. The soldiers slowly lowered their weapons. It wasn't mercy or compassion. It was confusion, maybe respect, maybe just a moment of doubt in a world where everyone always shot first. The nurse and the veteran seized the moment. They didn't run, they didn't fight. They just walked slowly, side by side, away from the line of fire. No one stopped them. No one fired again. When they were finally far enough, the nurse let out the breath she had been holding. The veteran, breathing hard, looked at her. For the first time, his hardened eyes seemed relieved. "In the end," he said with a bitter smile, "you were right. War isn't won with weapons." She looked at him silently, tears running down her cheeks. She knew they were still in danger, that nothing was guaranteed. But in that moment, they had chosen something stronger than violence. They had chosen to remain human. They walked together into the darkness, two figures lost on the border, not as enemies, but as survivors bound by the same choice. The nurse realized this was the real victory. To keep healing, to keep believing, even in the heart of hell. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell, and give a like so you won't miss more stories like this one. See you next time.